Hi, everyone, and welcome to Middle East 24, our ME24 Breakdown, which is our podcast that we started recently and where we invite top experts on the Middle East to break down complex and burning issues for you. I'm Hayvi Bouzo, co-founder and co-editor of ME24, alongside my co-editors and co-founders. With me here is Dan Feferman in Israel. Good evening, Dan.
Hey, good evening. Good to see you.
I wanted to tell our audience that Middle East 24 is your go-to source for fast and accurate information, analysis, and content on the Middle East. Our agenda is to cut through the propaganda and media bias so that you can get the real stories of what's happening. Launched in partnership with Visegrad 24, we make sure that you're following, and I actually want to encourage you to follow us on X, Instagram, and now YouTube. Links are in the caption. Also, make sure to give us a good rating on Spotify or whatever you get our podcast on. And every week here on ME24 Breakdown, we will take you behind the scenes on the hot issues of the day and what we believe are important issues that you're not getting here in the West and you're not really hearing about in traditional media and as much on social media.
Yeah, so today we are thrilled to be hosting activist, analyst, and media superstar these last 2 years. Unfortunately, why you had to become a media superstar, but Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib for a candid conversation about Gaza, about Hamas, about October 7th, and the hopes for the future. So welcome to ME24 Breakdown. And, I've actually been looking forward to this conversation for a long time, Ahmed. You and I connected a couple of times in person. And just besides you being a fun guy to talk to, and I think a straight shooter, I think you're also a rare voice in this field. And as I wished a guest we had a couple of weeks ago, I hope you be out of a job soon for all the good reasons. But Ahmed
Maybe
Fouad
a new
Khatib,
job.
yes, a new job, of course. I hope you be out of this job soon.
Inshallah.
Ahmed Fouad Khatib is the founder and director of the Realign for Palestine project at the Atlantic Council, senior fellow at the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Middle East Programs, a Palestinian American writer, speaker, advocate who grew up in Gaza City, left when he was a teenager, received asylum in the United States. You can get into more of the story if you want, but has devoted his career, his adult life to developing a new path forward for the Palestinians, for his native Gaza, and walking what I would describe, maybe you can agree or disagree with me, Ahmed, is a new line, a new voice, presenting a new voice between the very binary discourse we've always had that you have to be either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, and certainly a lot of the voices have not been pragmatic in this space. And so over the last couple of years, I say good for your career, but unfortunately for our peoples and the region, you've been on international news literally nonstop. And you also had multiple family members lost in this unfortunate war. And so we're here with you to try to unpack a lot of things, to get into what you're doing these days, and to try to see if we can get some nuanced and in-depth understanding of what's happening on the ground. How are you doing today, Ahmed?
Well, thank you for speaking with me. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Hayvi, for tracking me down. I know I can be quite elusive and difficult to get a hold of. I swear
And I
it's
could
not
be very
personal.
persistent, so.
It's nothing personal. Wallah, I swear it's nothing personal. It's just both. You asked Dan how I feel. I mean, one of the principles I follow in life is the idea of multiple truths. In many ways, I'm blessed to be where I'm at. I'm blessed to have built the space and platform that I have for myself. I'm blessed to be here and to have the safety and Western privilege as an American to say what I say. I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I'm upset. I'm resentful. I'm sad. I'm overwhelmed. But I'm not hateful. And I try not to be hateful. And that's a difference, big difference, because hate induces some of the worst tendencies in human behavior. And so I'm pushing through and I'm following closely what is unfolding and as far as the impending deal. I am in Washington, and so that comes with advantages and disadvantages at times, but advantages in the sense of being in close proximity to journalists, politicians, writers, analysts, think tankers, folks with hard intelligence on what's really happening, as well as opportunities. It's a challenge in that there's an echo chamber in Washington
Yeah, yeah, there's
can definitely be, people love the fresh perspective that I bring to the table. And the same people that love that fresh perspective are also the same to tell me how, I still need to fit into Washington's culture and do one, two, three, four, etc. But yeah, I'm blessed to be here and really happy to speak to you about all that's unfolding.
First of all, tell us about your initiative, Realign for Palestine, and how did you come to be involved in launching certainly something new on the scene, something that is trying to break the echo chambers.
Well, it began really with the tragedy of October 7th. I worked prior to that in philanthropy in Africa with global health and poverty alleviation issues through a research and a philanthropic organization. And during that time, I had participated in different initiatives. I started an organization 10 years ago to build an internationally run Israeli approved airfield in Gaza. That's why you see all those planes here. I have long believed in aviation's role in being a kind of a liberator of the Palestinian people's isolation, and I believe in the connectivity of Gaza and breaking its isolation as one of the many ways in which you can really initiate transformation in there. I flew into Gaza's airport, short-lived airport in 99 and in 2000 on the Palestinian Airlines. But it was then that I began interacting with the ideas and the principles of radical pragmatism and the idea of working with Israelis, the ideas of embracing Israeli security as a necessity, as a core need that is actually positive for the Palestinian people to be able to achieve progress. The idea of working with people not just in the left or in the center left, but in the center and in the center right. And so years later, when October 7th happened and I saw the tragedy unfold, I saw the horror emanating out of Gaza, the single worst day attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. I felt an immense amount of sadness, shame, and anger that my beautiful Gaza has degraded over the years to become the source, really, of this horror. And I was also horrified by the dehumanization of the Palestinian people and the portrayal of everybody in Gaza as a bloodthirsty terrorist, and everybody's Hamas, and everybody needs to be one, two, three, four, fill in the blank.
When was the
So,
last time you were there?
2005, I left
2005.
1 month before the disengagement or the withdrawal of settlements. I was 15, and I was supposed to be an exchange student here for 1 year and then go back to
Yeah.
Gaza. I was in Egypt in 2006 when I finished the program in San Francisco in California. And right as I was about to go into the Rafah border crossing to cross back into Gaza, Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit, a young Israeli soldier, and that resulted in a mini war, the border closures, so simultaneous with the 33-day war with Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yes, people forget that actually. By the way, that was my first year in the IDF, and so I remember it very vividly. But people forget that the Hezbollah, Lebanon War II started with the abduction of Gilad Shalit and about 10 days of fighting, the first round of fighting that we had between Israel and Hamas in a reality in which Israel did not control Gaza from the inside.
Certainly, sir. And so I was stuck in Egypt for 3 months, unable to go back into Gaza, and subsequently made my way back to the U.S. With the support of human rights and peace activists, friends and allies, and began the process of applying for asylum. Ironically, the very day of my political asylum interview was June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip.
Mm.
The very day. And so I was actually the first of a wave of Palestinians to receive asylum status in the United States due to Hamas's control of the coastal enclave. And I became a citizen of the United States 11 years ago. So going back to October 7th, I wanted to just offer a non-binary perspective that I felt was missing, both outside of the entrenched pro-Palestine or pro-Israel narratives. I vehemently believe that we are facing an existential crisis of epic proportions, that Gaza as we knew it would cease to exist, that this is not resistance, this is suicide, this is criminality, this is terror, this is horror. And I had been tracking throughout my time in the United States very closely Hamas. I mean, and I wrote about this for Newsweek last year. I spoke to Sinwar in 2017 when I was working on the Gaza International Airport proposal.
Wow.
And so, like, I'm very familiar with Hamas and how they operate, the tunnel infrastructure. Like, I grew closer even with Gaza to and with Gaza as a result of living in the diaspora. And so I started slowly putting myself out there on Twitter. I had 3 followers on October 7th. I had no presence really online. I started sharing voices and ideas, and to my surprise, people were really interested in hearing a not just a divergent Palestinian perspective, but one that actually represented something that other Palestinians felt, but it wasn't getting any oxygen in the media and the cacophony of voices. And over time, what was a passion project grew and evolved into a professional operation, leading to me moving to Washington from San Francisco and eventually becoming a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and eventually being able to create Realign for Palestine as a project under the umbrella of the Middle East programs or the Middle East
And
Center.
I will not, of course, know more about Realign for Palestine and what makes it different than other initiatives. Dan, you are in Israel, and we just basically went through October 7th, 2 years since the October 7th massacre. Tell us about the sentiment in Israel today. How are people feeling? And what is the overall sense today in Israel?
I kind of echo what Ahmed said with the feeling of being tired. This has been, and I'm sure we'll unpack this in different episodes throughout. But this has been a tremendous 2 years. This has been a 2 years that will change our little part of the world forever. I think, Ahmed, I think you can agree. We tend to think we're the center of the world, and maybe the world, I think, thinks we're the center of the world also. I wish people would ignore us. I've always said that if the world gave us the importance that it gives any other conflict, including many that are actually bigger than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this would have been much easier to solve. And I think the whole world jumping in here and adding levels of symbolism and importance to what was essentially a conflict over land, over identity, two tribes, it would be much easier to solve. But the day itself is something that was beyond shocking to us here in Israel. I live an hour from the northern Gaza Strip. We watched it unfold in real time like an absolute horror movie. Um, and helpless. I mean, that was really the feeling that every Israeli I know um, conjured up during that day was a feeling of just helplessness. And we keep saying this is the worst atrocity to the Jewish people since the Holocaust. We have to remember one thing about the Holocaust and one thing about this. During the Holocaust, the Jews were not entirely, but almost entirely helpless. We did not have sovereignty. We did not have an army, and the world powers abandoned us. Um, and the whole point of the state of Israel was to have sovereignty and agency and to be able to protect ourselves. And so for one day we were absolutely naked, absolutely vulnerable. And the repercussions for it have been devastating. On a day to day, I'm very fortunate. And again, I'll echo what you were saying, Ahmed. On a day to day, I personally am fortunate. I have not lost anyone close to me in this war. Um, I live my life. Since with the exception of the people connected to the hostages, Israeli society has partly, if not mostly, gone back to normal. And I know the burden and the onus has shifted now to what's happening inside Gaza as opposed to what's happening in Israel. But this is still a huge, huge open wound on our society. We still have the supposedly 20 remaining hostages who are alive. And so there was not a sense of, we're not yet at the stage of Memorial Days. We're not yet at this, we're still healing from a very open wound. The news was full of a little bit of, where were you on that day? What happened to you on that day? Testimonials. I can tell you, and I want to get back to Ahmed here. I can tell you it was a Jewish holiday, the holiday of Sukkot, and I kind of purposefully, you know what? I'm going to be in the present, in the moment with the holiday. It has been an absolutely exhausting and taxing 2 years for us here, and I need a break, and the holiday gave me an excuse to have a break, and jump straight back into the thick of it the second that the holiday was over. But we're not yet at the stage where we can digest the magnitude of what happened, even in Israel, where again the devastation in Israel took place for a couple of days, and then if you live up north, it took for a good year. And then, of course, we had the Iran strikes. Missiles landed actually not far from my house and destroyed entire neighborhoods here. But this is going to be an open, festering wound for some time to come.
So for somebody like you who lived in Gaza, you grew up in Gaza. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think Realign for Palestine is different than, what for example, the Palestinian Authority has been doing? Ideologically speaking, what is it that is bringing to the table that is not what we've seen before from other Palestinian initiatives? Can you kind of go dive deep into this?
Certainly. So, Realign for Palestine is not just a project or not just a group. The Realign for Palestine is meant to be a framework. It's meant to be kind of a scaffolding upon which you can begin to build the next generation of Palestinian thought leaders, Palestinian, what to redefine what it means to be pro-Palestine, redefine what it means to even be like core tenets, if you will, of Palestinian identity and what it means to actually be Palestinian. And the way I aspire to do so is through kind of a two-pronged approach. The first is narrative work, and narrative work related to our history, learning from our mistakes, dissecting some of the decisions and that were made throughout the Palestinian national movement over the last 100 years that I think have directly led to some of the horrendous outcomes we are experiencing today. And unfortunately, not only has there been no effort to engage in kind of introspective historical reflection, but every time you try to do that, you will have an army of people, Palestinian and other wise, tell you that that's a form of blaming the victims and that you are therefore, horrible and you're terrible and how dare you. And what I maintain is that within the imbalance of power dynamics between Israel and Palestinians, with Israel clearly holding overwhelming power, there is plenty of space for Palestinian agency, responsibility, and accountability. And that is not blaming the victims. In fact, that is the first step to empowering the Palestinian people. And so that is kind of like a core thesis, if you will, of Realign for Palestine, is change from within, not from without, which is a fancy way of saying from the outside world.
Absolutely.
And so that can be applied to a whole host of issues. That can be yes, some people want to look historically, but I like to keep it contemporary and just look at, Hamas's suicide bombings in the 1990s that weakened the Palestinian Authority and the fragile yet viable Oslo peace process. I want to look at why hasn't there been accountability for why Arafat, or Yasser Arafat, didn't accept the Camp David proposal in 2000, and why has
Why do you think Arafat didn't accept?
I
Because
think
it was on the
part
table. It was there.
I think it my speculation is the only, and I still am constantly looking, but the only two things that I can think of is fearing Hamas and retribution and losing legitimacy in because Hamas moved the Overton window within Palestinian society. Hamas such that the ethos that existed in 93 and in the early 90s when he signed Oslo and acknowledged Israel, some of that had dissipated with Hamas's suicide bombings and all the different, like the society got radicalized into being less tolerant of peace with Israel. But the other component as well, I think, is the right of return issue, and how he felt he couldn't compromise on it because basically he had to give up on that file, on that topic. And so, and again, why can't there be a revisiting of that subject and just like an internal process? Why do we need, you know, all the Western and Israeli participants in the process to be the ones to actually retell that story for us? Why didn't Abbas go for the 2008 proposal? And sometimes we'll see, yes, he was interested, but no, Hamas was there. And Olmert will sometimes say, no, Abbas didn't go for it. But then in recent times, he'll be like, well, actually, Abbas got. And it's like, I don't care what Olmert says. I want accountability from the Palestinian leadership. Why wasn't there a deal in 2008? And looking at Hamas, for example, looking at the billions of dollars that have been poured into Gaza. I mean, more money was spent in Gaza than in virtually anywhere else in the Middle East, notwithstanding Iraq and right after 2003, to develop and build, and the UN this and UNDP, and it's
Yeah,
not just UNRWA, it's the UNDP and UNICEF
right.
and World Health Organization. It's like, and more aid per capita, and Palestinians were made aid dependent in a way that actually incentivized Hamas to say, okay, UN and the world, you take care of our people. Whatever money we get, we're going to build rockets and tunnels and this and that. Like, there needs to be accountability for that. So, to me, things don't just happen to us. Yes, there are nefarious players in the world, but we, however powerless we might be, are active participants in making our history and our future and our fate, and choices come with consequences and outcomes. And to me, there are many Palestinians who believe that, but are smothered by particularly the modern left, if you will, that believes in intersectionality, believes that, even terms like, the global South is always oppressed and people are people,
There is zero accountability in that
colonization,
mindset, right?
the post-colonial
Absolutely.
historical studies have really, removed a lot of agency
I
from,
believe they've removed all of the agency.
and
And
so
I think
that
it's been absolutely detrimental to your cause.
precisely that. So I want to promulgate that as something that is, again, empowering, not weakening. That's not bootlicking to the Zionists. That's not being weak. That's not defeatist. That's not cowering. That's actually the height of courage, is to acknowledge your failures, to acknowledge your weaknesses so that you don't repeat the same mistake over and over. That's actually the height of
Yeah.
growth and maturity and evolution. And so this, again, I'm simply describing the kind of philosophical underpinning of Realign for Palestine, upon which you can apply that mindset to October 7th, to the failed negotiations, to my thoughts on the right of return, UNRWA, aid dependency, but also to how we shape the future, how I want Gaza of the future to not be aid dependent, to not be about the United Nations running I don't want Gaza to simply be rebuilt. I want it to be rejuvenated, revitalized, reimagined, reconstituted, so that we're not just building a bunch of refugee camps and our people are going to be refugees in their own homeland. We reimagine the issues of historical significance. And then so that's on the narrative part with Realign for Palestine. On the policy part,
Mm-hmm.
there's some pragmatic short and medium term as well as long term, but let's just mix them all together and say, like, short term, I was a big proponent of the airdrops, food airdrops over Gaza, and I participated in missions myself. And although I know that airdrops aren't going to fix everything, what I really wanted to do and have been pushing for over a year and a half is to demonstrate that if Israel's legitimate security needs are addressed, Gaza's airspace can be open for business. You went to situate from a situation where for 24 years, the Israeli Air Force was the sole party that controlled Gaza's airspace, which it still does, but to a situation where the air forces of 12 nations were the ones
We're
that are
allowed to, yeah.
actually flying, and
That's an interesting point.
because
Yeah.
Israel's security was addressed. Same with the maritime corridor. So short-term policies or proposals with medium and long-term implications.
But how
Things
would you
like,
see Israel's involvement in that? Like,
well, I see
the
Israel as
aspect
a
of the
partner.
air of the. Mhm.
I mean, I see Israel both as a partner, but I don't like I contrary to popular belief, like I actually think Israel's interests in Gaza are primarily security, despite my fury with Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the far right and the elements of the Israeli government that are horrendous. I don't think the mainstream Israeli society, military or political class.
No,
I've
we
come
got
to
out, we
that
got out
concept.
of Gaza. I say this a lot. On Gaza, the mainstream Israeli opinion is to get out of Gaza. We got out of Gaza in 2005. We don't want to be in Gaza, and we
Certainly.
didn't want to have to go back into Gaza now. And so, yes, there are disagreements on what you call the West Bank, what we call Judea and Samaria, but there is almost no ideological disagreement on Gaza. We already there are elements of society, yes, who would love to retake Gaza, and especially after October 7th said, you know what, we just need to cleanse it, to start over, turn it into a parking lot. There are those voices, but they don't control policy, and this is something that they don't understand how the world views this, but also they don't set the government policy on this war
Can
or
I
on
ask you
Gaza.
both something, actually, since then you're an Israeli, um, Ahmed, you are a Palestinian. In terms of Gaza, because I have that question. I've met people in Gaza who told me we miss the days when the IDF was in Gaza. They were suffering so much under Hamas, and that was before October 7th. We know that there were synagogues in Gaza. Gaza is a place that also is mentioned in the Torah. I mean, it's like there is a history there. Like, could there be, and this is just me, I'm just like imagining a scenario like in a future Gaza that is actually peaceful, there's no Hamas. Like, could there be some sort of like a coexistence in Gaza? And then having like the reopening of ancient synagogues, having this kind of working relationships that actually happened at one point between people in Gaza and Israelis.
Certainly. So there are two separate components there in terms of relationships between Gazans and Israelis, um, both before October 7th, before Hamas took over, during the Palestinian Authority's reign, and before that. There were massively robust relationships. The workers, people coming in and out, Israelis coming in and out of Gaza. I think that can be restored absolutely over time when the trust has a chance to be rebuilt.
Right. That's the big
Exactly.
kicker right there
I know
is
that
how do
that's
you
the
restore
biggest.
trust? Yeah.
Yes, for
And
Israel is the trust and of course
and
security.
and if I'm going to be blunt and radical
Yeah.
pragmatism is
We
about
wouldn't
moving
have you on the
to.
show if you weren't blunt.
That's going to be a one-way situation where it's going to basically be mainly Gazans going into Israel, going through to the West Bank. I don't foresee anytime soon a scenario in which Israelis go back into Gaza, let alone a scenario where Jewish heritage and culture is thoroughly established in Gaza. Now, can that be reversed in a generation or two? Probably within 2 generations, if Gaza's put on a certain trajectory where you reconfigure and re-engineer Gaza's the Gazan identity into a cosmopolitan one, like Dubai, like the
Right.
Emirates did, like several cities did, then sure, that's attainable. I mean,
And the
the
original
Abraham.
Gazans were the Phoenician traders of old. Gaza was a Phoenician city. They were seafaring traders.
Well, and that's one of
Yeah.
my aspirations, for example, with Gaza policy, linking back to Realign for Palestine. IMEC, India, there's a proposal, the
Yeah.
India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. And I actually have been lobbying heavily for Gaza. Not Gaza's like an afterthought or like a tiny footnote in it. I've been lobbying heavily that Gaza actually be a central node in the IMEC corridor, such that it gives the Gulf nations, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, a like a hub basically overlooking the Mediterranean, to export energy to Europe, to have fiber optics that can power data centers and the digital needs of AI that the Emirates is betting big on. That there can be basically a corridor with an oil pipeline, railway, fiber optics and power connectivity that connects Gaza to the outside world and breaks Gaza's unhealthy codependency on Israel and Egypt. That's not to say Gaza won't have any relationships with Israel and Egypt, but I'm saying Gaza, just like people talk as part of the Abraham Accords, people talk about Israel being regionally integrated. I actually genuinely believe that you need Gaza to be regionally integrated, partly
Sure.
to shoulder responsibility and partly to effectuate an economic and a cultural change.
Absolutely.
70% of Gazans have never left Gaza, okay? Like they only know the outside world through their phone screens. And so, of course, there's going to be all sorts of trends toward radicalization. Of course, there's going to be isolation. Of course, they're going to be vulnerable to the Hamases of the world and to the circumstances also, because many of them know that Hamas brought the blockade with rockets and tunnels, and Hamas.
Do they acknowledge and know that? Because when you see the voices online, and this is something that infuriates me constantly, in that having these debates with people, and again, part of the problem is that the shockingly and maybe purposefully naive global far left, right? The everything is a complete victimization, and I appreciate what you're trying to do and to make this kind of to unvictimize the identity of the Palestinians here. There's no accountability. There's like, oh, there's a blockade. Well, and I was, I'm a former military guy. Why is there a blockade, right? There was not a blockade before Hamas took over and started smuggling arms in through the Iranians and through Hezbollah. That's why there's a blockade. Why are there roadblocks in Judea and Samaria? Well, there's roadblocks. There's not terrorist attacks because they're roadblocks. There are roadblocks because there are terrorist attacks. And so how do you instill that mindset shift of you know action, reaction, cause and effect, and then ultimately, like you've been talking about, accountability?
Well, so I believe, contrary to popular belief, even though you'll see Gazans, there's still pro-Hamas Gazans, there's still ignorant folks, there are resentful folks, there are folks who might hate Hamas, but they're no peace doves and they hate Israelis just as they much. So like And support for Hamas is multi-tiered. Some are ideological, which is like this much. Some are just Hamas has set up a network of patronage with jobs and charities and this and that. Some are just brainwashed with Al Jazeera and social media and the impressive, it's easy to brainwash people. And Gazans will tell you that in Arabic. They'll
Mm-hmm.
say that, like, khadana, we were deceived.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part of me that's like, how could you have been deceived? But then there's a part of me, I'm like, well, I'm just glad you're at least saying it. You're saying it a little bit too late right now. But like, they're like, the Hamas puts on these parades with the impressive, military uniforms that they shed during war, and then they're fighting with flip-flops and AKs. So like, there's tiers of support for Hamas, just as there's tiers for opposition to Hamas. There's opposition that's ideological, the Fatah people, or like the secular people, or the non-religious people. I know a few people in Gaza, al-Ladiniyin. They hate the term mulhid, which is like non-religious. They hate that term. They call themselves the non-religious.
Yeah.
And they're all very,
Ladinian, yeah.
They don't want to be called atheists.
but basically they're atheists, and they're
They don't
very
want to be
underground.
called that way.
They're,
Mm-hmm.
they're very underground. To be clear, I don't identify as an atheist, but like they like, I know a significant community in Gaza. It's a very significant community that, like, whose atheism was bolstered over the years, and especially since October 7th, because of Hamas and the whole narrative. Like what I'm trying to say is,
Kind of what happened under the Iranian regime. It's, people living under
precisely.
these types of like terrorist,
Theocratic,
Islamic
yeah.
extremist, yeah, organizations become less and less religious. That's what's
And like almost like militantly so. And so what I'm saying is like, so with that in mind, to your point, Dan, about the responsibility, like, I maintain that, and this is controversial to say, but I studied intelligence, counterterrorism, and national security. I actually think, in a weird way, there are elements of the war, not the whole thing, but elements of this war, as horrendous and as evil and as horrible as the suffering has been, and despite all the suffering and the terrible and the atrocities, there's actually been an element of de-radicalization along the war, along the lines of the war, in the sense that people will not, Hamas or Hamas 2.0 or whatever, there will never again be anyone that comes along and is able to mass
Mm.
deceive and mass brainwash people into saying, let's try this again. Let's waste another 20 years. Let's take all the billions of dollars. Let's weaponize all of the medical and educational infrastructure and build tunnels and the rockets. Let's beat you up. Let's torture you. Let's shoot you. Let's kill you. Let's do this horrendous war and then hide like rats and let you guys face off against Israel and hold hostages. So it's not just the consequences of October 7th, and like and yes, there are people that cheered on October 7th and now they're like, oh my God, the consequences are horrible. We hate Hamas and we hate October. Yes, those people exist. But I'm talking about I would argue, an even bigger trend here. Yes, it's partially the consequence, but the Venn diagram is even bigger of Hamas's behavior during the negotiations, during the war, Hamas's behavior before the war, Hamas having basically bastardized the whole idea of resistance. That is something, the total picture, it's a whole portrait right now that has been painted and clarified. Khalas, it's in people's face. And
Yeah.
you might still hate Israel or Zionism, this or whatever, but whether you're saying it online, whether you're quiet, whether you're whispering it to your neighbor, whether you're saying it at a family dinner, you're like, in Gaza. I'm talking in Gaza. Forget Palestinian Americans, forget Palestinians in the West Bank. I'm talking about where it matters the most, in the Gaza Strip. People are not stupid.
Mhm.
You still need a lot of work to nurture that energy
But
and
there's a shift.
transform it. there's 100% a
And
shift.
I want to talk about that, and I actually would like to also like talk about the difference between Gaza and the areas where the Palestinian Authority is controlling, because obviously there's a big, I think, like difference in public opinion there, and we definitely need to unpack the Trump's proposal. But I actually
Right.
want to ask you, Dan, because we've just talked about like okay, like a vision for the future. We know that the communities that were attacked on October 7th were the most pro peace and coexisting communities in Israel, and they had already really good and deep and long-term relationships with people in Gaza. After October 7th, how would you imagine a scenario where people who are on the borders of Gaza will trust any future, situation? The public opinion in Israel following October 7th. If, and we're all probably here, I would assume, are hoping for the return of the hostages, a deal to end Hamas, end the war, hopefully go into the future, but how would you describe the situation in terms of the public opinion in Israel regarding
Yeah.
this?
You said something that's very important for people to understand, and that is the communities in southern Israel, by and large, that were the ones hardest hit, and I visited them many times since October 7th. These were the most left-wing, anti-government, pro-peace. These were people who were volunteering to take, sick children from Gaza to medical care in Tel Aviv. These were people who, these were communities that were hosting Gazan workers in their communities every day, bringing them into their homes, feeding them, offering them tea on a first name basis, and the betrayal that we know that they give maps to Hamas of this family lives here and there's four kids here and there's an army guy here and there's you know two parents and three children here, and they mapped out all these communities is something that's going to be very hard for Israelis to trust again. Um, I something that's kind of a bit of a chicken and an egg that we are going to need to figure out if we don't want to have perpetual conflict, right? Is that you know how do you have to buy Israeli trust again, and from the Palestinian, at least the narrative that comes out, and again you're breaking this narrative to a large extent, Ahmed, and I appreciate that, is well, the Israelis have the upper hand in the power dynamics, so they have to make all the concessions and they have to make the moves. But the Israelis, people don't understand this in the Arab world about Israel, right? Israel is militarily stronger than literally all of the armies combined, economically stronger than everyone except maybe the Saudis and the Turks. But when Israelis look at the region, they are a minority in a sea of, again, from a simple Israeli perspective here, a sea of hostile Arabs. And October 7th was the epitome of what happens when you let your guard down, what happens when you're too nice, what happens when you're too forgiving. So there's going to be a need to be a culture change, a deep culture change, and something that you touched on, Ahmed, is how deep is the change, the potential for change taking place in Gaza. Something you mentioned that resonated with me, that I've said many, many times in talks that I give all over the place is I would love to see a Palestinian Zionism. And when I say that, I mean the concept of an agency, the concept of self-determination, the concept of, that's what the Zionist movement was for the Jews. It was, we're not going to rely on the foreign powers to dictate our lives anymore. We're taking things into our own hands, but in a positive way. And I always, whenever I meet
So you
anti-Zionists
mean like
or
a Zionism-like movement for the Palestinians?
exactly, a self-determination that isn't, victimhood, that isn't blaming the other, that is what is the Palestinian identity? Because I have yet to meet, and maybe you're the guy, maybe there's hopefully 100 or 1,000 more of you along the way, that the identity and the goal of Palestinian nationalism is not to erase Israel, but it is something self-actualizing, and that's what Zionism is. And so I love talking. I meet college kids for all the time. I've hosted many people from all over the Arab world in Israel, and I always love asking them. And I've even had people tell me, I have no problem with Jews. It's the Zionists that I have a problem with. And I always say, do you know what? Define to me what Zionism is. Well, it's a racial, and it's a conquering, it's a suppress. I said, self-determination for the Jewish people in our homeland. That's it. I didn't say left or right. I didn't say anything about the Palestinians. It is an internal self-definition that has nothing to do with who you are, Ahmed, or what your aspirations are. Now, of course, there is a practical overlap, and so there's a practical conflict there. But my identity as someone who is a Zionist has nothing to do with denying your identity. It might come to that practically on some levels, but ideally, ideologically, it has nothing to do with you in a good or a bad way. And so that's kind of what intrigued me about what you were doing to begin with. Hayvi, I think we can get to a point. There's going to need to be a lot of trust building. There's going to need to be a lot of investment in culture, deep culture change. Look, if Israelis today, and by the way, I know many Israelis and many Jews around the world who refuse to go to Germany to this day. Okay. But it is if Israelis are able to have a generally healthy, positive relationship with Germany of today, anything is possible. I always like to point to the fact that Germany and France were mortal enemies for many centuries. And today you cross the border without a passport. For years, for decades, Israelis went to Gaza to go shopping, and Gazans would come to Israel to go to work. We can get there one day, but there needs to be a serious culture shift in Palestinian society that I believe it will be reciprocated by Israel, because the Israeli people are not deeply hateful people. They're scared, they're suspicious, but they're not hateful. The second the Abraham Accords were announced and people could go to first the UAE and then later other places, you saw, the kind of, oh my God, we can be friends with Arabs mentality in Israel that from people on the right, the people you would never expect to have those opinions. We do want to take advantage of the fact that you're with us here to talk about the current Trump plan and what's unfolding now as negotiators are in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, Ahmed, and get kind of more into the policy and then finish out with where this could go. As we were, setting up this recording, Witkoff and Kushner were on their way to Sharm el-Sheikh, or they'd arrived. How do you understand the Trump plan? I understand it basically that Hamas is definitely a loser in this, but the Palestinian people, broadly speaking, are not. And the Israeli right is a loser, but the Israeli people, broadly speaking, are not. How do you view the general framework as much as we know about it?
Well, I actually think that's a brilliant way of putting it, as like people are winners in the sense that um for example, you started talking about the Israeli right. I mean, this basically effectively ends talk of permanent occupation, the displacement of the Palestinian people, the resettlement talk, taking over Gaza by the far right, which is a sharp U-turn from what Trump had shared in February earlier this year. So in that regard, like the far right in Israel parties that have viewed what Trump was doing back then was trying to push the Arabs into thinking outside of the box and kind of creating this frenzied, drama to get people moving.
That's how I saw it too. I saw it as get off your ass and do something, quit talking and actually do something.
And instead, what that unfortunately ended up doing, though, is it gave life to a lot of folks in the far. It gave life to the fantasies for folks in the far right. As far as Hamas, absolutely. You got to think about this deal in the following framework. It really is two agreements slapped together. It
What do you
really
mean?
is. The first agreement is the ceasefire and hostage and prisoner swap. And then the second agreement is the future of Gaza, and that is disarmament, international stabilization force, kind of like the gradual ending of Israel's direct military control and the initiation of recovery and rebuilding of Gaza. And so the first one is basically what Hamas said in like yes to. in the sense that the Arabs, I mean, the Qataris, the Turks, and the Egyptians have all applied massive pressure on Hamas. Everybody has made it clear to Hamas, this is it. There is no more deal. There is no more renegotiations. There's no more agreement. This has to be the end game, or you're on your own, dude. We're done. Khalas. So Hamas said yes to that because the deal was sweetened, if you want to use that term, by the fact that of the 290 security prisoners with life sentences, 250 are set to be released. I mean,
Right.
that's practically the majority of them. And Hamas is haggling over who's on that list and who's not.
And there are some big names on that list as well.
Precisely. And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm concerned about who's on that list because I mean, a lot of Palestinians are worried about the Sinwar syndrome. Like I don't want I mean, if just 1/4, 1/4 of these 250 names come out and re-engage in terrorism within, like how long did it take Sinwar to basically, it took him like almost like 15 years to get to a place where he did
Right. Well,
October 7th.
to remind our viewers, Yahya Sinwar, who was the mastermind of October 7th, who was the internal Gaza leader, the radical voice of Hamas in Gaza, was released in the Shalit deal in 2011, I believe. He was one of the
Yep.
1,000
Yep.
terrorists who was released, and he and many others came back to be a part of the October 7th attack.
Precisely. But so anyway, so there's that component, and Witkoff and Kushner are there right now. And the latest suggests, I mean, they're still there. The latest suggests that they're not leaving Sharm el-Sheikh in southern Sinai before the details are finalized. They're
Wow.
not leaving before they're able to basically have the hostages released. They're not, there's no longer this push by, we saw earlier a push by President Trump about Hamas releasing hostages. Like you have to release them within this timeline, and then there's
Right.
this
Well, we've
timeline.
already passed the 72 hours.
And well, not only that, but also once they got there and they realized that the mechanism for the release is a challenge, and Hamas is saying, well, it's going to take us quite a while to find all the bodies, and they're trying to play monkey games. And then Hamas now is trying to link the two agreements together. For example, they're trying to link the last hostage leaving with the last Israeli soldier leaving Gaza. And that is not what the agreement
Right.
originally framed. And so, could there be an impasse there? They just supposedly today, there was an exchange of the lists of prisoners that are to be released. And supposedly, Hamas provided a list of some of the names that they've been able to tally, if you will, and make contact with thus far.
Mm.
So I am optimistic that the first component of the deal can happen. What concerns me, however, is the idea. I mean, is can you truly? There's two ways that this can happen. Hamas initially wanted guarantees that, fine, we'll decouple the two separate agreements, but we need massive guarantees from Trump himself and the Turks and the Arabs and the Europeans and everybody that once the last hostages are released, Israel won't restart the war. And for some reason, that seems to have shifted to actually, well, no, never mind. We need Israel to withdraw fully from Gaza once the last hostage is released. And that's a big development.
That wasn't part of the agreement that Israel agreed to. Israel agreed to withdraw to certain lines that leave a buffer space inside of Gaza. I have two questions I want to ask you here, to give us some insights. You mentioned the Turks and the Qataris, the two main backers of Hamas. Now, Turkey, in this government that's been there for the last 20 whatever years, and the countries are pro-Islamist, they're pro-Hamas, they've been the main financial, ideological, political backers of Hamas. Is it your understanding that they finally understand they have to throw their pet project under the bus here? Is it pressure from America? And if it's pressure from America, why hasn't this been happening since Trump came into office or even before in Biden? I understood from day one, and certainly there's a very long list of Hamas experts ahead of me on the list of people who claim to be experts on anything. The only way this ends is if America and maybe the Abraham Accords countries pressure the Qataris and the Turks to pressure Hamas. So why hasn't that happened? And then maybe it's a separate question, maybe it's not. This is essentially Hamas agreeing to its own dismantlement. So I don't see, any way that Hamas actually accepts this. So how do you walk us through both of these?
Certainly. So let's start with the Turks. That's an easier one to go through. They're seeking sanctions relief. I'm sure you've noticed, maybe you haven't, they want in on the F-35
Yes.
stealth fighter
That's
program.
They
And they're
resumed
going to
the
get
talks today.
and they're going to get the updated F-16s, both packages to existing fighters as well as new ones. They desperately need to renew their Air Force, which has old F-16s. Sanctions relief, open capital markets, and a new Air Force, basically. That is worth every penny that is totally worth sacrificing Hamas over the national interest. Because at the end of the day, everybody is looking for the national interest, and ideologies around Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, there's no gain whatsoever there. And Trump, he wanted the restoration of flights, Turkish airline flights to
I saw
Israel.
that, yeah.
And so it makes total sense why Erdogan, and you saw even at the UN when Trump, he had Erdogan sitting right next to him at the UN General Assembly. I don't know if you caught that picture of Trump meeting with Arab and regional leadership. So the Qataris, on the other hand, and I helped expose the presence of one of their corrupt fixers, if you will, who's close to the leadership at the White House meeting. And Politico this morning was reporting that he was there to make sure Netanyahu, Qatar, basically helped write part of the script of the apology. And the Qataris
Makes sense,
Of
yeah.
Hamas?
No, the Israeli apology to
the
Qatar.
Israeli apology to Qatar
Yeah, makes sense.
for the airstrike. And so he was there at the White House sitting right next to Witkoff to try to actually make sure that Netanyahu read the same script. And that's why Trump was right next to him. Trump was holding the phone. I mean, Netanyahu was cornered by Trump and the Qataris. Can't make this stuff up. It's tremendous. And by the way, I personally despise Mr. Netanyahu, but still, politically, I despise his politics. I still can't believe just how that unfolded and how that went down. So I very much so believe that the Qataris, once they got their apology, and there's a kernel of truth. Like I've seen Al Jazeera Arabic show less of the Hamas right before the declaration of the possible ceasefire. They used Television Al Arabi, the Arab TV, which is another Qatari sponsored one, but all the Hamas propaganda Qassam videos of hitting Israeli targets and soldiers, Al Jazeera showed none of them. They all exclusively.
For now, they're not going to change that.
And actually, go ahead, because I actually was going to ask you about this specific
But
point,
what I'm saying, I mean, I don't believe they're going to all of a sudden moderate and become moderates. I don't buy that for a second. I'm simply saying that to get this apology, they are now presenting this like, okay, fine. We're going to roll back our coverage of Hamas. We're going to pressure Hamas maximally. They allowed Khalil al-Hayya, the head of Hamas, to come out with the first video statement since the attack. and they're like, okay, khalas, like we're gonna now really apply maximum pressure. And so I think the Qataris just basically realized that this is the end of the road. Like there's no more that they can do with Hamas. There's no more tactical value they can extract out of Hamas. Hamas has been a liability now, and that Hamas is the reason why they got hit from Iran and from Israel in 1 year. I mean, that is like the presence of the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the core central
It's supposed to protect them.
field,
Yeah.
didn't protect them from
No.
either. So they're genuinely reassessing their national priorities, realizing that we can't just rely on the United States, but in order to not have to rely on the United States, we need to not give anybody an excuse to come after us. I don't know what happens beyond. I mean, the fact that Hamas is then safe in Qatar. So there's a part two to this saga, which is some of these prisoners are supposedly going to go to Qatar, supposedly. Some of the like high value ones that get released.
Right.
So
What do you think about, so that's another component. We know that like Israel would, when it did the airstrikes on Qatar, it was a message, regardless of the fact that the targets were not eliminated, but that they will be, basically Israel will strike them wherever they are, right? Now, the question about Hamas's future is a very kind of the point of contention right now in the negotiations, because we know that the disarmament of Hamas is a part of the plan, but also it's not being mentioned as much right now. We're hearing about the part one, and Hamas is literally, like you mentioned, Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera yesterday on October 7th was all of its coverage was about Hamas. Basically, the spokespeople of Hamas were on Al Jazeera. They were just talking about what happened in Gaza, did not mention what happened on the massacre, but it was like more of like Hamas is saying that they won, that they actually had achieved something, in committing October 7th. So that's what they're trying to push in Arabic. Yes, they are trying to do a couple of games here and there in terms of like, let's have the Al Arabi TV do this. They deleted a content they were sharing where one of their analysts, who's also Hamas, was saying things along the line of, oh, Israel committed a mistake in the war on Gaza. So it's the same kind of propaganda that we've been seeing, but the future of Hamas is what's kind of stayed vague in,
certainly,
yes,
certainly.
in the
Well,
conversation about it.
I mean, this is the part to me that's the most troubling of the whole thing is like the deal did not, before the withdrawal of the Israeli military, basically, if you end up in a situation whereby there's Israel is fully out of Gaza, then Hamas is going to consolidate its control, re-emerge, reconsolidate, and then they will abso-freaking-lutely go ahead and prevent the entry of any international forces into Gaza. So you need to have the presence of a third party force before, as the Israeli military is pulling out. Otherwise, Hamas will prevent their entry. Hamas will not accept their entry, and the Arabs are not going to go in a head-to-head confrontation with Hamas. And then you have Hamas saying that
There's no chance, Ahmed. There's no chance the Arabs go head to head with Hamas, right? I mean,
no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. What you need, the only way you go after Hamas, I mean, the Arabs being there protects the local population, restores law and order. They can go after some of the criminals and the gangs and the looters. But in terms of a counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency operation,
it has
there's
to be
no
Israel.
way. Well, or it can be two forms of auxiliary forces, or three forms. Number one, it can be Palestinian Authority forces.
Do you
And
see them going after Hamas?
Would
I
you
don't.
agree with that? Like, that's actually a good question about the Palestinian Authority. Like,
Well, I think if at the end of this whole exercise, you dangle in front of the PA that if you want Gaza, then you have to fight for it. they will absolutely go up against Hamas. So it could be, and
Do you
I'm
think they're
laying
capable? Do you think they're capable?
so over time, I think if they get basically if you give them little bases of operations after which they can grow and recruit people and slowly expand, then absolutely. The main problem is they're going to need some form of air support, drone air support, and maybe this force can provide it to them. So there are three possibilities. Auxiliary forces. This is my proposal or my thought on who can take on Hamas once the international forces come in. It's the Palestinian Authority, it's private contractors of Arab, regional, and international backgrounds. And then it's local militias that are a combination of clans, locally trained gunmen that are under some form of an umbrella, like David Petraeus did with the Sons of Iraq or the Awakening Council in in
Hamas.
Anbar and Ramadi and Fallujah
And we
in
saw some, and
2007
we saw some
and 8.
clashes, right, between some of the tribes and
There
Hamas.
have been clashes, yeah.
Recently.
Oh, and Hamas, yes,
Yes.
yes, absolutely. But what I'm saying is those three types of forces, if they have a base of operation, if they have some degree of air support, if they have a place to retreat to, and if they have a safe area from which they can stage, recruit, and recuperate, they will absolutely, over time, basically retake Gaza neighborhood by neighborhood, street by street if they have to. They will go into the tunnels. They will need time. They will need some tech. But that's where the international forces can kind of, from a distance, be like, okay, I'm going to just create this perimeter. The civilians are safe here, but anybody in this area is safe. And if Hamas comes into our areas, we're not going to be a bunch of cowards like UNIFIL in southern Lebanon.
Mhm.
We're going to actually strike Hamas. So the rules of engagements, this is why it cannot be a UN peacekeeping mission. This is why the French actually, you see, most people don't give them credit. As much as I may be, you Israelis and others might be suspicious, or we may mock French diplomacy, what Macron suggested was actually brilliant. There actually
Which
is
was.
like the peacekeeping. He said, I don't want a peacekeeping force because peacekeeping forces actually have a lot of bureaucratic
They're also shockingly ineffective. However,
precisely.
the French do have something that other countries do not have, and they have gendarmes. They have forces that know how to operate in this low intensity space,
Paramilitary type.
paramilitary that is not quite
Exactly.
full military, but it's also not police, and it's somewhere in the middle. And Israel, by the way, does not know how to do that. And the Americans don't really know how to do that either, but the French and the Italians actually know how to do that very well.
But I before the UN, sorry, Havy, just to
Yeah,
finish
yeah,
the thought,
please finish.
before the UN, I was long calling it a stabilization, and some of my artistic
Stabilization force. Yes, that's the
stabilization
term.
force.
Yes.
And I was delighted that the French and Macron said, I don't want to do a peacekeeping force because the budgetary, the political, the
Mm.
legal, the bureaucratic at the UN are prohibitive. Whereas if you do it as a stabilization force, you can stand it up much faster. The donations are the costs are voluntary. You can activate it much faster. That way it can be
Mm.
dynamically deployed. You can dynamically update the rules of engagement as you go. Instead of, I need to now go to the Security Council every time they need to shoot one, bullet at this guy or that guy. Meanwhile, the guys are just sitting there. You saw the pictures of them in southern Lebanon. The Hezbollah guys came up to the soldiers and were like slapping these guys with guns, and the UNIFIL soldiers just stood there and they're like,
Yeah,
"Oh, okay."
exactly. They took it and they couldn't do anything about it, and that's been their history. I actually wanted to ask then about the same question that I just asked you, Ahmed, which is about Israel, the Israeli government, because Prime Minister Netanyahu said it
Right.
before, but then we're not hearing it today. I know this is an ongoing situation, but in your opinion, would the Israeli government accept a deal that doesn't include the disarmament and the dismantlement of Hamas as a result? Of course, we want to have the release of the hostages. We all want to see the end of the war afterwards, but Hamas being dismantled, I think this is kind of a one of the kind of main
That is the main goal of this war. That is
conditions,
the
right?
main goal of this war, because otherwise
Yes.
you didn't win the war, and Hamas.
So
Look,
what do
I'll say something unpopular, and then I'll be glad to hear kind of a final thought from you, or a second to final thought from you, Ahmed. I know you've been gracious with your time.
you
I'm going to say something probably unpopular here in Israel. The main goal of Israel's war um, was to defeat Hamas. And to defeat Hamas, Hamas has to be disarmed and dismantled. That doesn't necessarily mean every last fighter, but as a governing force, as a force capable of waging acts of terror. And I think even more, I think Israel and really the region need to see Hamas actually accepting terms of surrender in whatever way it's phrased. Otherwise, this war cannot end, and that's what Hamas wants. They just want to regroup.
Mhm.
Um, that said, my sense is there is going to be so much pressure on Netanyahu from Trump and from the White House, especially you mentioned people are talking about Friday. If I understand correctly, the Nobel Peace Prize timing is involved here. And as much as I like a lot of things this administration in Washington has done, I don't hold it past this president and his administration for a second to bully forth a deal that might be less than optimal for Israel because it gets him that peace prize. And I don't say that as a critique of world leaders have their motivations and etc. But there could very possibly be a scenario in which this doesn't actually lead to the full disarmament of Hamas because there's going to be so much pressure from the White House to see it through. Um, and it will become very unpopular here. And I still think Netanyahu will have no other choice because if there's one person Netanyahu cannot cross, it is Trump. So that's the issue. Ahmed, second to last question, I think, before we wrap up is how does Hamas accept or not accept, or my sense is squirm its way out of a deal that essentially dissolves the organization in its whole raison d'etre? How does Hamas contend with this?
Well, and that's where we're seeing them try to be like, oh, is it offensive weapons versus defensive weapons? Oh, and
Right.
like they might do like a shot for the cameras. I mean, remember the tunnels, 500 kilometers. Most Hamas guys themselves don't know the full extent of the
Right.
tunnels. A lot of the guys because they're so heavily compartmentalized because they knew if one of them got arrested, they didn't want him to be able to tell on everybody else. And so some of the guys that actually had the full knowledge, they're like at the grade of Leif and Marwan Isa and some of the top guys who are already dead. It might be months or years for Hamas itself to
Mm.
rediscover all the tunnels they have. And so there might be a couple of guys in there. There's Izzuddin al-Haddad, the last remaining big shot there, who might actually know where all the tunnels are, and they might hide some of the guns down there and then bring out a few rockets and a few IEDs and a few hand grenades and be like, Shufu, Shufu, look, we're just
Yeah.
giving them up,
We're
and
still here.
so there might be deception. There might be this attempt to like delineate between offensive or defensive weapons. There might be a way to try to stall for time. There might
Mhm.
be a way in which Hamas basically ends the war and then Gaza just becomes, sustained by humanitarian aid, but there's no recovery. There's no Gaza becomes a mini Somalia and you have militias and there's no progress. So like I don't see Hamas giving up willingly. However, there could be a scenario in which maybe we see either an organic and a native Palestinian militancy against Hamas, we could see a scenario in which a popular uprising against Hamas once the
Do
war
you see
stops.
such a scenario?
If Hamas stalls and Gaza becomes in this purgatory where it's just sustained by handouts and
Yeah.
humanitarian aid, then absolutely, I think enough people will just be like, well, we're all living in tents. We have nothing to lose. The pausing of the stopping of the war could absolutely give rise to a
And we've
combination.
been seeing a lot of anger. We've been seeing so many videos from people in Gaza talking about Hamas, protesting against Hamas. There was before, but Danaish, there was a whole movement. So there's and then
Protests in
sure,
23 before
yes,
October 7th,
yes.
2019, 2017.
Yeah, and the world didn't cover it because the channels that were in Gaza, they were all collaborating
Doesn't
with
match the
Hamas.
narrative.
But precisely that, precisely that.
Yeah.
But then I do want to, if I may, and I unfortunately I'm running
Yes.
out of time, but I do want to address something you had brought up earlier, and I think it's a good note to end on, just stepping back from the policy and just tying everything back together, and which I actually think represents why what I'm doing often feels like a truly thankless job, and how I'm flanked by both folks within the pro-Palestine and the pro-Palestine quote and the pro-Israel quote. There's pro and pro in both, and then there's the quote communities, and those are the people that really do go for the binaries. And you know, I am not sustained by Arab Americans or Muslim Americans or Palestinian Americans or by many in the West Bank who are angry at the Palestinian Authority's corruption, angry at the Israeli military occupation, and therefore think somehow Hamas is the answer. And I'm like, have you ever had to live under Hamas's rule? Have you ever had, I mean, you can buy liquor and alcohol in the West Bank, okay? People hate the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, but single one of those haters expects a paycheck at the beginning of the month. And so they hate the PA, but they love the PA's money, okay? They hate Israeli stuff, but they are all desperate to get a work permit and go work in Israel. So and all of that goes away if Hamas takes over. So I just think it's as much as the West Bank has suffered horrendously under the military occupation and the violence and the settler violence. It is still not the same as having 18 years of your life robbed living under Hamas, with October 7th and the most destructive chapter in contemporary Palestinian history being the crowning piece of it. Similarly, the pro-Palestine people of Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, or leftists, or the far left and the far right in the West who want to, or the Arabs that watch Al Jazeera, or the pro resistance crowd. Like, sure, it's easy to cheer on Hamas from a distance. It's easy to be anti-Semitic. It's eat from a distance. It's easy to, be deceived. Again, deceived by all the garbage you see online. Some people are deceived. Some people are genuinely unintelligent. Some people are actually evil. They're actually horrible, horrendous people, and I just wish nothing good upon them. There are many whom are just, they care about the Palestinians. They're desperate. Some are angry at Hamas, but they don't want to speak out against Hamas. So, we have to exercise nuance and understanding why there are pro-Hamas sentiments or why there are anti-Israel sentiments. I maintain that there's more to being pro-Palestine than simply being anti-Israel. But the reason why I'm saying all of the aforementioned is that is a widespread of a community. And when they see a Palestinian from Gaza who lost family members, there's a lot of them, they're like, oh, of course you're going to be anti-Israel, right? Of course you're going to be for resistance, right? Of course you're going to be for revenge. I'm like, no, actually, I want to honor the legacy of my fallen family members by breaking away from this vicious cycle. Some people, they step back and like, oh, that's strange. Some people, they're like, oh. okay, and they'll think about it. Some people are like, oh, you sell out, you spy, you're traitor, you're this, you're that. The good news, however, is that the number of Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians who privately reach out to me and say, Ahmed, thank God you're saying what we know is true, but we have a hard time saying so publicly. I couldn't get a play date for my child when I started speaking out against Hamas, or people at my mosque went crazy, or my in-laws are insane, or my community or people on social media.
Has that changed?
I mean, no, the number I would argue is growing of Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians in the diaspora. But what is really sustaining me 2 years in, and despite the threats and the death threats, and I've the FBI involved, and I've all that stuff, the number of people in Gaza who are like, that number keeps rising, who are like, dude, this guy is onto something. This Ahmed.
Are we going to see you as the future Palestinian Prime
You know,
Minister?
that's what I was going to ask you. What do you see your role in?
I have no political aspirations in Palestine, but I want to be of service from afar, from up close. But I'm not really motivated by political office in that context. But just to finish the second piece, Dan, and this is just as important, is that unfortunately, and you're my brother, and I'm gonna just be a little bit harsh here, and I've seen you sometimes partake in this, is that there's a widespread spread number of people who love when I criticize the pro-Palestine narrative. They love when I criticize my own people. They love when I'm anti-Hamas. They love when I am focused inward on our issues. But when I inevitably and rationally have to critique Israeli policies, historical trends, policies is an umbrella under which, yes, history is part of Israeli policies. Like that post when I said about Israeli unilateralism. And by the way, I have ambivalent feelings about the recognitions of a Palestinian state. I think it's helpful. I think it's useless. I think it's...
I didn't come after you on that one, by the way.
But
I didn't come after you.
Why you're mentioning then in that context? Like, in which way? Because, like, in my opinion, then it's very...
but no,
it's okay.
No, I haven't finished the thought.
Yeah.
The idea being, when I say those things,
you're applauding,
that are critical. People are like, oh, you don't do that, by the way. But there's grades of that. People are like, Ahmed, I thought you were a real peace activist. Ahmed, I thought you're really interested in coexistence with Israel. Ahmed, you're just like every other Palestinian. You're doing taqiyya. You're doing this. You're a wolf in sheep's
clothing. Yeah.
And people just lose their shit. So, like, my point, excuse me, people just lose their mind.
It's okay.
My point is that, like, not only is that silly in some regards, but, like, this is part of why a lot of Palestinians who are like-minded, they struggle to build actual dialogue, not just like, let's hold hands on the things we agree to. Like, because of course we're critical of Israeli, like, this is not a one-way situation. Like, of course we have historical mistakes and we are part of a lot of the disasters, but it is undeniable.
You're gonna have gripes with Israeli history, no question.
And expressing that, like, and to be fair, there are many right-wing Israelis and center-right Israelis that, to their credit, they tell me, and I see it. They look at it, they don't agree with it, they just, okay, you're right, I disagree. My point is,
this is the dynamic I wish for, where I wish every Israeli and every Palestinian can sit and have this discussion and this debate and realize we're not going to agree on 100% of history.
Precisely.
But can we agree on a shared future?
But the baseline that I have brought to the table, quite honestly, like, is more than many in the Israeli and pro-Israel community are ever gonna get anytime soon from a Gazan who lost half of his fucking family. And
Yep.
yet, when I don't, in their mind, toe the line, there's this like immediate like,
Yeah.
because as if my job is to make them feel better, as if
Right.
my role is to validate the beliefs of pro-Israel people on the center right. And that is not my job. I am doing this from a purely Palestinian self-interested point of view, A, and B, because it is the right and moral and ethical thing to reject violence, to promote peace, and to actually see Israelis and the Jewish community and self-identified Zionists as partners. That is the right thing to do. But first and foremost, I am a Palestinian. I work for my people. That is my aspiration. I believe in the realization and actualization of the Palestinian aspirations, even though my own people can sometimes, we can be our own worst enemies. You follow? So that's where it's frustrating. But like, Israel, full right to exist and should exist and as a Jewish state for the Jewish people, alongside a safe and a prosperous state of Palestine that has freedom, dignity, and self-determination. Like, it's Hamas and the criminality of some of the Palestinians, absolutely off the table, and absolutely some, like, all the fundamentals are there, but they are quickly ejected when I, deviate
But
from
I
some.
want to tell you something, Ahmed. Like I'm a social media personality too, okay? And you're gonna get all types of people. You're gonna get people who are gonna be more on the angry side. There's gonna be people who are gonna be more trolling, like actually trolling. And in general, if you're talking about interactions that you've had even in person, look, this is a very, very um, emotionally charged,
Yeah.
long-term conflict. And
Precisely.
there's a lot of emotions attached to it. And we're going to have people who are going to disagree. And I'm talking probably about the three of us here. And a lot of the people who probably already are trying to also bridge the gap, trying to connect people. You're going to have people who are not going to feel at ease about you trying to say something or express an opinion that it's really tough for them personally, right? And we know, Ahmed, on the Arab side, it's not only gonna say like, oh, I'm really disappointed that you said that. It's gonna be like, you're a traitor, you're a
And
spy,
you die,
you're
and
gonna be killed.
and
Exactly.
and
So
let me
like
kill you, and I'm coming for you. And
exactly. So on the Israeli side, on the Jewish side, on the West, in the Western debate, it's different. Now, of course, we know that what's happening is that some of those radical elements from Arab countries are actually talking here and trying to radicalize and have the same
precisely,
violence, right?
precisely.
But it's okay to disagree and it's okay for people to be emotional as long as they're not trying to, silence the other. I think that's the
Or just or
point,
kill.
right?
Like, I'll take disagreements and anger over like threats to like kill you.
Yes.
Exactly.
No,
Like,
but the reason, Dan, just to conclude, the reason I feel strongly about this point, I have thick skin, man. Like,
You
clearly,
got to. You got to.
you
Yeah.
have to,
You
exactly.
have
Or
to.
like,
else,
it's not so much like that, oh, like, I'm hurt. My God, how dare they criticize
yeah,
me?
yeah.
That's not the issue. The issue is I envision, and I have a lot of Palestinians who, so, a few of them come out and comment and speak and engage on my content. A lot of them passively participate. They'll just like and watch from a distance. A lot of them just are like, okay, I want to see like, and I'm trying to. You said, am I a rose in the desert? No, there are thousands of Ahmeds out there. They might not. They might be afraid. They might be this. They might be with a family. They might not speak English as well. They might have a
And I
job.
agree with you, Ahmed. I've been seeing this shift in the Arabic language, and I keep talking about it.
So
So,
like, I wanna bring those people
Yeah.
along, and I want
And
them to engage Israelis and not just the leftists. I actually have a harder time
it should
talking to
engage the
Israeli
right. Yeah.
leftists than to like center and center right people. But sometimes like, it can't be that these people are glorified when they're against Hamas, but they're demonized when they're against Netanyahu or the settler violence or behavior of the Israeli military, because otherwise, like there has to be some capacity in which we figure out this dance of topics and what's the common ground, and how do we, instead of friction, it's like, how do we just bypass, and then we come back here and then we bypass, I've been able to do it. And a lot of the people that criticize me, they'll come back around, because unfortunately for them,
Yeah.
I am one of the few outspoken voices. So they're like, we're stuck with Ahmed. We have no one else. No, I'm just kidding. But that's what I wanted to. I feel strongly.
I totally get it. I totally get it, and I appreciate the way you do it. And the test will be in another 3 months, 6 months, a year. How many? I think you're gonna have two tests. And this is what I'm looking for, because I've been watching your career the last 2 years. Is how many more people are willing to vocally support you? And secondly, how many venues? I'm looking for today when you speak, not just at Jewish venues or universities, but I'd like to see you speaking at mosques. I'd like you speaking at, Muslim community centers, or in communities that maybe are civic but have large Muslim populations, bringing this new way of thought and this constructive approach going forward. And what can I say? Wish you success in that endeavor. Hayvi, we've taken a lot of Ahmed's time, and we appreciate it. So
No,
maybe
it
let's.
was really great to have you
Yeah.
on, Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. Like, this is such a timely and important conversation. Of course, we would love to see it continue. Would love to have you again in the future. And I'm hopeful, actually, for this deal, for the return of the hostages, for the end of this war, and hopefully Hamas will be out of the picture, and people in Gaza would have a better future, because they also suffered a lot. And we just basically would love to, kind of maybe have kind of future conversation, hopefully soon.
Yeah.
That way,
Let's have a future conversation when we
Let's have good news.
solid news.
100%. And
Have good news.
we'll bring some other people along with for those conversations. I'll bring some other people to be a part of those.
We just wanted to give you the time today, but I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody for listening and watching ME24 Breakdown on Middle East 24. With you is Hayvi Bouzo, co-founder and co-editor, and with me is my co-founder and co-editor, Dan Feferman. Thank you so much, and please follow us on X, on Instagram, and now on YouTube, and also subscribe and give good rating to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever you are using to listen to us, and stay tuned for next time.